U.S.-China relations front and center. Chipmakers are under pressure as the Biden administration reportedly considers tighter trade rules on China. The trade conflict with China, however, just being one point of tension between the nations. Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump speaking out about Taiwan, sidestepping a question of whether the U.S. would come to the island's defense. Joining us now, former U.S. ambassador to Singapore and KraneShares managing director, David Edelman. David, thank you so much for being here. So we are looking at these headlines today and trying to parse out what is the state of the U.S. relationship with China, particularly when it comes to trade. I guess we'll take that part of it first, where we hear the Biden administration, according to these reports, is proposing maybe having even more stringent requirements on selling of chip technology. What do you make of that? Do you think there's going to be any response from China? And what does it achieve in the end?
Well, first, thanks for having me on. I think the general state of U.S.-China relations is unchanged. We are in a strategic competition with China. These are two very large economic powers competing within a single system, a global economy. I expect there to be a lot of very sharp rhetoric in the next 3.5 or 4 months in the run-up to the U.S. general election in November of this year. There is bipartisan consensus in the U.S. Congress and really throughout Washington that is forming or has formed around a more hawkish, more muscular policy towards China. But nonetheless, there's also a clear recognition that the U.S. economy and Chinese economy are interdependent, so to speak. Now, with regard to the specific headlines you referred to, I do expect the Biden administration to continue to look towards export controls as a way to, in the interest of national security, protect against certain very specific chip manufacturing equipment being exported to China. I think that will have perhaps the unintended consequence of accelerating mainland China's chip manufacturing and foundry ecosystem. With regard to the Trump comments related to Taiwan, look, America's policy towards the defense of Taiwan since 1979 has been based on this idea of strategic ambiguity, if you will, leaving open the question of the extent to which the United States would actually respond with its own troops in defense of Taiwan should there be a military attack across the Taiwan Strait. So I think the Trump comments are consistent with American policy since 1979. The news, I suppose, is around this idea that former President Trump has argued that Taiwan should be spending more on its own defense. My interpretation of that is it's similar to the Trump posture towards all American allies, whether they be in Europe or Northeast Asia or elsewhere, that other countries should be increasing their defense spending, which inures to the benefit of U.S. defense industries, I would add.
David, I want to go back to something you said because, the U.S. government has been very focused on trying to stymie China's ambitions to become this real global tech powerhouse. It sounds like you were saying, David, that you don't think we're going to have much success in that effort long term.
I don't. I think the Chinese economy is very powerful, and I think it's in America's interest to try to run faster rather than trip your opponent in this race towards, a technological advantage. I worry that export controls that go too far could ultimately inhibit or impede the development of chip foundries and chip manufacturing outside of China, and could actually accelerate China's development of its ecosystem. Look, China has made it very clear that they are interested in a domestic chip manufacturing ecosystem, and they will and do have the resources to invest in the development of that system. It may never really compete with that which exists in Taiwan, which has the special sauce, so to speak. But nonetheless, I think it can meet China's demand for chips. And this is especially of concern if you are convinced that this sort of high-end chip manufacturing capacity raises real national security concerns for the United States. I'm less convinced.
So if you are indeed less convinced and you don't think that's a good strategy, what do you think, what is the alternative strategy in that case then? What do you think, whether it's this administration or whoever the next administration ends up being, what do you think the strategy should be?
The alternative really is to double down on the U.S. and Taiwan's chip manufacturing ecosystem and create a dependence, if you will, so that China is dependent on foreign manufacturing and foreign foundries for chips. That was the case until relatively recently, and I just worry that export controls, if they're too strict, can have unintended consequences. I think the same is true for any trade tariffs. I think it could have the unintended consequence of, in some ways, strengthening Chinese manufacturing capability and promoting Chinese products to markets other than the United States. If you haven't caught on yet, I'm a big believer in globalization, and I'm a big believer that the integration of the Chinese and American economies are irreversible, and that we really both operate in a single global economy. That's not to say there should be no export controls, but when I served in the government and Bob Gates was our defense secretary, he was a strong advocate for the so-called higher fences around, a smaller yard. And I certainly believe that export controls are appropriate. But I think if we're overly inclusive in those export controls for political reasons, they could have the unintended consequences I've described.
David, really interesting stuff to consider as we continue to follow this developing story. Thank you.